FAFSA Simplification, Use of Federal Tax Information, featuring Dennis Kramer, Director, Policy Research and Analysis Group.
Welcome everyone to breakout session number 9, FAFSA Simplification and the Use of Federal Tax Information under the FAFSA Simplification legislation. My name is Dennis Kramer. I am the Director of the Policy Research and Analysis Group here at Federal Student Aid, and looking forward to our conversation today about how the FAFSA Simplification and the Future Act have modified the use of FTI in the FAFSA and IDR processes. As just sort of a agenda setting, we're going to go through a number of items. First, discuss sort of the current state of federal tax information use under the data retrieval tool. Then we're going to talk about the Future Act and the Direct Data Exchange, or what we call the FADDX, and how that change is going to facilitate different considerations and uses of federal tax information in the new environment. Discuss potential risk of misusing FTI at the for states and institutions, and also your third-party servicers and vendors, and then get into a discussion about how we might use FTI and FAFSA data in award year 24-25, and how this data can be leveraged, and what are the permissible leverage points for outreach on other federal basic need programs. We'll end with the slide sort of outlining resources and outreach that you can utilize if you have follow-up questions. So just to sort of orient the conversation and why some of these changes have been occurring or are going to occur in our use of federal tax information, we have a set of Consolidated Appropriations Acts from 2021 and 2022 that put into legislation different provisions around the use of federal tax information for federal student aid and federal financial aid applications. In the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2021, we have sort of the codification of the Future Act and the FAFSA Simplification Act. Right? The Future Act is this modernization approach that expands access to federal student aid and further mandates federal student aid's use of data directly from the IRS rather than the current sort of data retrieval tool that we have in place. As you know, there's, in 2021, also we had the FAFSA Simplification Act, which introduced a number of changes to the FAFSA application process and how we engage with our customers in the sort of application process, as well as the provisions that we put into place to ensure accurate and timely use of federal tax information. I should note that there are a number of other sessions at this training conference that will go in depth into the Future Act and the FAFSA Simplification Act. So I encourage you to engage with those, as well as the in-depth session on the sort of federal policy update. In 2022, the Consolidated Appropriations Act made a number of corrections to the FAFSA Simplification Act. Right, first and foremost was the extension of the simplification timeline to the implementation in the award year 24-25. And it provided a number of other changes that we're integrating into the FAFSA process. Again, these changes will be discussed in depth in sort of other presentations, and I encourage you to sort of engage with those, as they'll provide sort of the technical information around those changes and how they might be operationalized in the sort of FAFSA application process. But for us, these technical changes also provided some additional insights into how we might utilize federal tax information in the 24-25 award year. So just to sort of level set, this is certainly known to all of you in this presentation, but under the current state, we utilize the IRS data retrieval tool. It's a tool that was introduced in the early 2000s that provides an option for our FAFSA applicants to populate their application with federal tax information filled in essentially by the IRS. What's important to note is that under the DRT, the IRS does not directly provide federal tax information to FSA. Rather, the DRT allows the taxpayer to transfer their data from the IRS populated into the FAFSA form, and then the individual applicant is the one who then transfers that data to the IRS, right? And so essentially, once that tax data is then entered by the DRT and then transferred by the taxpayer through the FAFSA process, it's then considered FAFSA data for the purposes of data use restrictions under the Higher Education Act. This is an important distinction to sort of continue to reinforce as we think about how that might change under sort of the 24-25 Future Act considerations. Right, so as we move into award year 24-25, the Future Act has amended the IRS or the Internal Revenue Code to authorize FSA to receive individuals' federal tax information directly from the IRS, provided that the individual has given explicit consent to retrieve that tax information. So unlike the DRT, the FADDX, or the Direct Data Exchange, provides that data directly from the IRS to FSA and the department, unlike the DRT, where it provides to the taxpayer, and the taxpayer then submitted it to FSA on their own behalf. So because that data is coming directly from the IRS, this direct data exchange maintains that the FTI remains IRS data rather than sort of FAFSA data that was sort of in our current state. And because it's IRS data, that data is protected by a set of more stringent or more prescribed confidentiality and non-disclosure provisions that are, not mandated by the Higher Education Act, but are mandated by the Internal Revenue Code. And so as we move into an FADDX environment, we are now going to, from an FTI perspective, have to sort of manage the use and the data protections under our current HEA as well as the Internal Revenue Code. So to dive a little bit more into the FADDX, right, the Future Act again authorizes FSA to receive this data, or federal tax information data, under a set of limited purposes. First, they explicitly provide a use of this data for the FAFSA form, particularly to determine eligibility for and the amount of student aid that an individual would qualify for under Parts A, C, and D2 within Title IV of the Higher Education Act. They also explicitly provide provisions or uses of FTI data in determining eligibility for an income-driven repayment plan and the repayment obligations that may be required under those plans as written in the Higher Education Act. And finally, it provides explicit uses of FTI data for the Total and Permanent Disability Discharge Program, right? Particularly around the monitoring and reinstatement of loans that are associated with the TPD program. So under sort of the Future Act, we have these sort of very explicit uses of where FTI can be integrated into our systems to determine eligibility and benefits under the Higher Education Act. So again, as we sort of shift into this new environment, we not only do we have additional protections and considerations around disclosure of FTI starting in 24-25, there are an elevated risk of the misuse of FTI that we don't currently operate under as through the DRT or our current tax information. In sort of worst case scenario, the IRS could undertake criminal enforcement actions against personnel whom the IRS finds to have inappropriately used or redisclosed federal tax information, right? So this is what we would determine as a violation of Section 6103I of the IRS code, or of the Internal Revenue Code. So this risk not only extends to sort of institutions of higher education, but it also extends to third-party servicers and vendors if those vendors are operating and servicers are operating on behalf of the institution. So the sort of considerations for the redisclosure, and the use of federal tax information are elevated as we move into a 24-25 award year. But there is sort of a set of use cases that the department and federal student aid have worked through and identified for institutions and states. First and foremost, a FAFSA applicant may authorize or must authorize the use of federal tax information through the FAFSA process to be disclosed, including the redisclosure of that data, to an institution of higher education, a state higher education agency, and a designated scholarship organization. As part of the FAFSA simplification legislation, an applicant must consent to the sort of retrieval of their FTI information through the FADDX. That consent then allows the redisclosure of that data to institutions of higher education, state, approved state higher education agencies, and designated scholarship organizations that are sort of outlined in sort of current regulations and statutes. From a higher education agency, there's additional sort of opportunities to utilize the disclosed federal tax information to administer state-based financial aid programs. And so as individuals consent to the redisclosure of their federal tax information to state agencies, these state agencies are allowed or permitted to utilize that FTI, that federal tax information, in order to administer their own state-based financial aid programs. They also can use that information to determine eligibility for those state grant agencies, but there are limitations around what they can use outside of determining eligibility for state-based financial aid. Information provided on the FAFSA can be used, with the exception of the federal tax information, for state agency research, so long as it does not release any identifiable information pursuant to sort of the regulations that promote college attendance, persistence, and completion. So we know a number of states are engaging in sort of college attendance, persistence, and completion initiatives. The data from the FAFSA in a 24-25 environment can be used, with the exception of federal tax information, to promote those activities, so long as there's not a disclosure of individually identifiable information. There is sort of also a provision that allows the sort of identification of individuals who may or may not have completed the FAFSA to determine whether that application is on file, and encourage local education agencies or secondary schools to encourage students to complete the FAFSA application. Again, this is sort of identifying those in sort of a set of an application pool that may be eligible to complete the sort of annual FAFSA application, but who have not done so yet. There is provisions that allow the state agencies to engage in those activities to support FAFSA completion initiatives. There is sort of other options or another provision that says that state higher education agencies may share the application information, again excluding federal tax information, with any other entity only if such applicant provides explicit written consent to disclose that information. So if there are other, agreements and uses that are currently happening within the state education agency, they must obtain explicit written consent from the applicant in order to redisclose FAFSA data outside of FTI to those individuals. The redisclosure of FTI in nearly all cases would not be permitted. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that as we get further in this presentation. Additionally, for our state higher education agencies, any entity that receives applicant information from a state higher education entity with the applicant's explicit consent shall not, like it was very clear, shall not be permitted to sell, share, or otherwise use the information that they're provided, other than for the explicit purpose to assist such applicant in applying for federal, state, or local assistance. So while there are provisions to share data with consent, even with consent, that data that may be disclosed to another entity from a state higher education agency is not permitted to be used for actions other than is outlined here and in the legislation. So there's sort of explicit guardrails around how that information can and can't be used. So from an institution perspective, institutions shall use the information provided from the FAFSA application starting in 24-25 for the application, award, and administration of financial aid to the sort of submitting applicant. Again, institutions similar to states may use the information provided on the FAFSA form, excluding FTI, for research, again, so long as it doesn't promote identifiably or doesn't disclose and release identifiably information on the applicant, so long as that research is focused around college attendance, persistence, and completion. So again, there are a number of sort of research partnerships that are sort of engaged in the sort of change from the data retrieval tool to the FADDX in 24-25, and the direct disclosure of data from the IRS limits the sort of use of, or currently limits the use of federal tax information in these sort of research activities. But these research activities can leverage other FAFSA provided information on college persistence, completion, and attendance. Again, these educational records, which at the institution level may be shared with other entities only when explicit consent is provided by the applicant. So again, similar to the states, institutions also have the sort of onus to ensure that if they disclose these records, or the use of the records themselves shall not be sold or otherwise used for anything other than the application, award, and administration of financial aid to the applicant. And so we can sort of, again, we want to sort of reinforce that in 24-25, there are additional sort of provisions that are associated with the use of FAFSA data under the FAFSA Simplification Act that limit sort of institutional use of FAFSA data to the application, award, and administration of financial aid. And financial aid being the broad sort of federal, state, and local aid programs. So as we sort of engaged in conversations with states and post-secondary institutions, there was a number of sort of requests for the use of this data to provide assistance to applicants and students to access other federal programs. And in January 2022, there's a Dear Colleague letter published that provided guidance on the sort of designations under the Higher Education Act that permit the use of FAFSA data to aid in the sort of identification and access to several other federal benefit programs. So in particular, the Dear Colleague letter outlines the use of FAFSA data to support child tax credit take-up, recovery rebate credits and economic impact payments, the Supplemental Nutrition and Assistance Program, the Affordable Connectivity Program, health insurance enrollment, and other federal assistance programs. So under sort of the current Dear Colleague letter and current guidance provided, institutions may use FAFSA applicants' email addresses and other relevant information to notify effective students who may be eligible for these three following programs: child tax credit, recovery rebate credit, economic impact payment, and the health insurance enrollment. Institutions may further utilize FAFSA data to verify that students meet requirements directly with the state supplemental nutrition and assistance program agencies. provided that the institutions obtain the prior written consent of the student under FERPA regulations, and that other applicable privacy laws to disclose the student's FAFSA data to the state Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program agency are in place. Institutions are also permitted to use such information to conduct outreach to potentially eligible students for the SNAP benefit. So if there are sort of cases in which institutions would like to identify students who may be, or who they determine would be eligible or potentially eligible for benefits under the SNAP program, they can engage in sort of outreach utilizing the FAFSA data and contact information gathered from the FAFSA form. So institutions may also utilize the receipt of a federal Pell Grant along with information provided on the FAFSA form to communicate with students whose households are potentially eligible for the Affordable Connectivity Program benefits. As sort of receipt of a federal Pell Grant is one of the ways in which an individual may qualify for this benefit. So institutions, again, may engage with individuals with their students who they feel may benefit or may be eligible for this program. They may also provide them a certificate or an indication that they did receive a federal Pell Grant that can be used with the FCC to document their eligibility for this benefit. There are also other programs that are provided, or federal assistance programs that are provided, where institutions are permitted to utilize the FAFSA data to outreach to their students and identify potential benefits. Unemployment insurance and housing assistance being two of those programs. So there are limitations for the use for outreach for basic need programs, right? And you can sort of see under 483A3E, institutions should limit FAFSA data use and the data that they use to the items that directly relate to the information to inform students about their eligibility. And I'll sort of point you back to the January 2022 Dear Colleague letter, because it provides sort of a more in-depth treatment of the sort of limitations and regulations that institutions must adhere to when utilizing FAFSA data to conduct these sort of outreach activities. I'll also sort of point you to the financial aid data use and student privacy presentation from our prior training conference that provides additional information on sort of how FAFSA data can be used in conjunction with FERPA to provide individuals with access to additional federal benefits. So I'll just sort of finish by highlighting a number of resources that are available for you. We have the 23-24 handbook that will be published in the fall. That will provide additional insights into use in the 23-24 award year, as well as conversations about how it might be used going forward. There will be ongoing webinars about how we might use federal tax information and FAFSA data in the current state, as well as we move into a 24-25 FAFSA simplification state. And there are a number of resources available to you in the FSA Knowledge Center and through the FSA Toolkit that can provide clarity and information on what might be a permissible use or disclosure of federal tax information. We will continue as an organization to develop trainings, both in person and virtual, that'll further sort of discuss the sort of changes and current understanding and guidance around the 24-25 FAFSA award year. I want to thank you all for joining me today to discuss federal tax information. I welcome the opportunity to answer questions. Thank you again. Have a great day.